Today, we are undertaking a deep dive into the most iconic, enduring, and frankly just frustrating mysteries in criminal history. Yeah, unsolved murders, right? And this isn't just about reciting sensational facts. We want to understand why these cases go cold, sometimes for a century. We're really digging into the sources to see how these huge failures in detection, these gaps, how they actually shaped modern law enforcement, forensic science, and even pop culture. Precisely. And if you look across this whole spectrum of cold cases, from the Victorian era all the way to the 21st century, they aren't just isolated tragedies. No, they're crucial touchstones. You see these repeating patterns, the limits of the technology at the time, the incredible power of a media spectacle, and the just devastating effect of procedural errors right at the start. And we're going to connect those dots for you. Exactly. We'll show how those historical missteps still cast a shadow over investigations today. Okay, let's unpack this. Let's do it. We should probably begin where, you could argue, modern criminal notoriety was born, in the historical shadows of 1888 London. The Autumn of Terror, Jack the Ripper. The Ripper case is absolutely foundational. It was one of the first times a killer achieved, immediate global infamy. The sources point to 5 main victims: Nichols, Chapman, Stride, Edados, and Kelly. That's right, all targeted in the Whitechapel district. And the sheer savagery, the way the brutality just kept escalating, the deep throat wounds, the mutilations, it must have been pure panic. It shocked the Victorian public into mass panic. And what's so fascinating here isn't just the crime itself, but the communication strategy, the letters. Yeah, the letters. Whether they were authentic or not is still debated, but they were signed Jack the Ripper. And that act of writing to the papers, of naming himself, it instantly turned a local tragedy into this worldwide phenomenon. It's like a primitive form of terror marketing. It absolutely set a precedent. I mean, the police, they were dealing with gaslight. Minimal forensics fingerprinting was decades away from being standard. They were just overwhelmed, completely overwhelmed by the rumors, the panic, and the killer achieved this true lasting anonymity right in the middle of all that chaos. That urban chaos is such a stark contrast to our next case, which is this profound, isolated horror. The Villisca axe murders in Iowa, 1912. Here, the horror wasn't lost in a crowd. It was trapped inside a single farmhouse, and it was horrifying. 8 victims, the entire Moore family, and 2 visiting girls murdered in their sleep. It's a scene that's so memorable. Oh, it's meticulous and just bizarre. The killer covered every mirror with cloth, drew all the curtains tight, and draped clothing over the victims' faces. That feels so ritualistic. Or maybe the killer just couldn't stand to see their faces or his own reflection after the act. It could be, and it's so unnerving that he apparently waited in the attic before the attack and then just left the bloodied axe leaning against a bedroom wall. And in 1912, that procedural gap, there's no scientific profiling, no real evidence collection. It allowed the killer to just vanish. They had suspects, like this traveling preacher George Kelly, but the case just dissolved into trials and speculation, leaving the community completely haunted. Totally. It shows how the focus shifted from, searching crowds in London to profiling neighbors in a remote American town. And speaking of isolated dread, we have to talk about the Hinterkaifeck murders in Germany, 1922. This one is famous not just for the violence, but for this profound sense of pre-crime dread. The victims, the Gruber family, 6 of them, they were killed with a farming tool, a mattock. A mattock, it's basically a heavy curved mattock, a tool of immense blunt force, but the buildup is what's so chilling. Right, Andreas Gruber had seen footprints leading to the farm, but none leading away. He heard footsteps in the attic. An unfamiliar newspaper just appeared on the property. The intruder was already there, with him hiding for days, maybe, and then the ultimate violation. After the murders, the killer stayed. The sources are clear on this. He tended the livestock, ate meals from the kitchen, kept the farm running for several days before just disappearing. That cold, calculated composure afterwards is just terrifying. And that calculated composure is the thread that connects us to the mid-20th century. This is where the focus shifts from the killer hiding in the attic to the killer performing for the camera. Exactly. Media sensationalism becomes this inseparable part of the story, which takes us right into Hollywood, 1947. The Black Dahlia, Elizabeth Short. A 22-year-old aspiring actress, her body found severed and posed in a vacant lot. This wasn't just a murder. It was a dark piece of street theater. The theatricality is what cemented its infamy. Her body was severed cleanly at the waist, completely drained of blood and scrubbed clean. And the face. The defining feature, cited everywhere in the original sources, was the facial mutilation, the so-called Glasgow smile, deep cuts from the corners of her mouth toward her ears. And the press just seized on it. They nicknamed her the Black Dahlia after a movie that had just come out. And the investigation became a circus. I mean, hundreds of false confessions. All that media noise must have made it impossible for the LAPD to find any real intelligence. It crippled the investigation, and it created the template for this media-fueled, glamorized true crime obsession that, well, it's plagued LA investigations ever since. Here's where it gets really interesting, because we move from that sort of passive spectacle to active manipulation of it. We're talking about the Zodiac killer. The Zodiac, yeah. Operating in Northern California in the late 60s, he didn't just let the media sensationalize his crimes. No, he engineered it. He absolutely engineered it. He shifted from attacking couples in parked cars to actively communicating with the press. He used fear as a currency, sending letters, these complex ciphers, to newspapers, demanding they be published, and threatening more attacks if they weren't. He signed them with that chilling circle and cross symbol, and he openly taunted them. He claimed confirmed murders, like the cab driver Paul Stein, but then bragged that he'd killed 37 people in total. The cryptographic challenge is arguably his most enduring legacy. Those ciphers became a national obsession. You had cryptographers, military intelligence, amateurs all trying to crack them for decades. And despite a primary suspect, Arthur Lee Allen, and all this communication, nothing. He just disappeared. His ability to communicate, to confuse, and then to vanish, leaving all this complex data behind, it was a complete paradigm shift, which brings us to the late 20th century and a new dynamic. Cases that forced systemic societal change, starting with a crime that wasn't about theatricality but about something random and terrifyingly accessible. The Tylenol murders, Chicago, 1982. This attack was just unprecedented. 7 people died after taking extra-strength Tylenol capsules that had been laced with potassium cyanide. The horrifying part was the method. The killer just bought the bottles, tampered with them, and put them back on the shelves. It was random terror, hitting the most mundane, trusted product you can imagine. The consequences were immense. Johnson & Johnson had to issue a massive $100 million recall, and that economic fallout completely changed corporate responsibility overnight. That is the key analytical takeaway here, even though the killer was never charged with murders. Right. A man named James Lewis was convicted of extortion related to the case, but not the murders themselves. But the crime's legacy is global regulatory change, the reason we have safety seals. It directly led to tamper-evident packaging on basically every medicine and food product worldwide. It's maybe the most impactful unsolved case in history, purely from a legislative point of view. That's a profound outcome for a case that's still cold. Moving forward to 1996, Boulder, Colorado. The tragedy of 6-year-old JonBenét Ramsey. This case is such a critical, modern example of how important procedure is, no matter how advanced your technology gets. JonBenét was found dead in the basement. This was after a 2.5-page ransom note was found. A note demanding $118,000, a figure that was suspiciously close to her father's recent work bonus. It was. But wait. If the Ripper case taught police in 1888 about contamination, how could investigators in 1996 with DNA technology let the Ramsey scene get so compromised? That is the central frustrating question. The answer is procedural failure, compounded by high-profile chaos. The sources are very clear on this. It was an immediate failure. Friends and family were allowed to move through the house for hours before the scene was secured. The initial focus was on the kidnapping, not on a potential homicide scene. Exactly. And that early mishandling meant that DNA, fibers, trace evidence, it was all hopelessly intermingled or just destroyed. We've had partial DNA clues over the years, but that initial failure has probably foreclosed any chance of a definitive answer. Then just 3 years later, 1999 in London, we see a different kind of high-profile failure. The murder of the BBC presenter Jill Dando, shot execution-style outside her home in broad daylight. This was a massive public event, and it triggered one of the largest investigations in British history, and they did get a conviction. Barry George, a local man, convicted in 2001. But the legal outcome failed. The conviction was overturned in 2008 because the DNA evidence was deemed inconclusive, and he was acquitted in a retrial. Right, so you have this ultimate paradox. Immense resources, high visibility, an arrest, a conviction, and in the end, no justice. And the theories are still all over the place. Contract killing, political motives, but nothing with definitive forensic proof. And we see a similar kind of modern paradox in the 2000 Setagaya family case in Tokyo. Oh, this is the one where they have tons of modern evidence, yeah, but it still leads nowhere. Precisely. The Miyazawa family of 4 brutally killed. But the attackers stayed for hours afterward. Right. They ate ice cream from the fridge, used the family computer, even took a nap on the sofa. So the police recovered a trove of information. Fingerprints, DNA. DNA that pointed to someone with mixed East Asian heritage. They found clothing items he left behind. But the technical challenge was that the DNA, while robust, didn't match anything in the existing databases, meaning the killer probably wasn't a previously documented offender. Exactly. The sheer volume of evidence was undermined by the killer's simple anonymity. It proves modern forensics still relies on having a profile to match it to. Our final deep dive is maybe the ultimate identity mystery. A case where the victim herself is the anonymous one. The Isdal woman, Norway, 1970. This one feels like a Cold War spy novel. It really does. Her charred body was found in a remote valley surrounded by burned belongings, gasoline, sleeping pills, and what was immediately disturbing was the methodical effort to destroy her identity. Every single label was cut out of her clothing, fingerprints wiped from everything. She had essentially erased herself. While traveling across Europe, she'd used multiple false identities, different names, wigs, spoke several languages. Investigators thought she might have been a spy. It was a strong theory, especially with all the NATO activity nearby at the time. The official cause of death was poisoning and burns, but there were bruises that suggested foul play. And the puzzle now is trying to restore her identity. For decades, they've used isotope analysis on her teeth and bones to figure out where she grew up, likely Central or Eastern Europe. But despite these incredible technological leaps, her name, her identity, remains unconfirmed. It just shows that sometimes the simplest barrier, an erased name, can defy the most sophisticated science. So what does this all mean? Yeah, we stand over 130 years here. From Jack the Ripper using pen and paper to terrorize a city, to the Setagaya killer leaving DNA all over a sofa. If we connect this to the bigger picture, I think the most important lesson is structural. The failures are constant, but they shift based on capability. How so? In the 19th century, failure was because of a lack of technology and urban chaos. In the mid-20th, it was media manipulation overpowering the investigation. Then in the modern era, it comes down to critical contamination like with JonBenét, or the killer simply being outside of searchable databases like we saw in Setagaya. Despite all that forensic information, the legacy is immense. Some cases sparked cultural fear and became horror blueprints, like the Zodiac. And others, like the Tylenol murders, forced major regulatory change that affects how we all live today. They stand as these brutal reminders that our detection technology is only as good as the procedures and systems that support it. They really are, and they're reminders that, ultimately, these cases are defined by that initial, often simple failure to identify someone before they disappear back into anonymity. And we want to leave you with this final provocative thought. We've examined crimes from the Rupper's chaos to the high-tech anonymity of the Isdal woman. Considering the unique element of audacity in these crimes, the Hinterkaifeck killer who stayed for days, or the Zodiac demanding newspaper coverage, which act of calculated psychological violation do you find the most profoundly unsettling, and what does that reveal about the nature of unresolved fear in our society? Think about the lingering questions these tragedies leave behind.